today's sermon in our series, Exodus, Set Free to Follow God, here is Senior Pastor Mark Rader.
So we've reached, I suppose, in Exodus now, the climax, or at least what we might be forgiven for assuming is the climax. And we are in the book of Exodus, and if your Bible's like mine, in chapter 12, verse 31, there's a heading that says, the Exodus. So we're at the Exodus in the book of Exodus, so surely this must be the pinnacle, the climax of the story. And while what we encounter here, the freedom of the people of Israel and actually leaving Egypt, is a fairly significant piece of the story, just kind of flicking ahead a little bit or having a look on your device to see how many chapters are left, we're not yet halfway through the story. So there's more to come. There's some really significant things that the narrator wants to draw our attention to, and this is just kind of one really significant point along the way. Let me just really briefly remind you of kind of where we've been up until this point in time. The people of Israel have been in Egypt for several centuries. In the last little while of that, they have been enslaved and oppressed by Pharaoh. Moses has been raised up by God, sent to Egypt, and has told Pharaoh that the Lord, the God of Israel, has said, "Let my people go." Pharaoh's response is, "Who is the Lord, that I should obey him? I do not know the Lord, and I will not let them go." And that question, that challenge to the identity and power of the Lord sparks a whole set of plagues that get unleashed against the Egyptians. Those increase in severity and complexity until we come to what happens in chapter 12 with the death of the firstborn all across Egypt. And it's at this point, finally, that we have this remarkable breakthrough where Pharaoh, in his last-ditch attempt to control the situation, and it's an empty gesture, but he demands that Moses and Aaron come to his presence so that he can tell them that it's okay for them to go and worship the Lord, as if he really had any choice at this point in time. All the gods and goddesses of Egypt whom he represented have been shown impotent and unable to resist the Lord in any way, shape, or form. So his attempt to control the situation one more time is almost laughable. And he sends the people of Israel out. There's one more twist in the tale. In the second part of chapter 13 and chapter 14, Pharaoh has one more change of heart, and he chases after the Israelites, and we have that epic moment of salvation at the Red Sea, which we'll look at next week. But the narrator, I think, here in chapter 12, verse 31 till chapter 13, verse 16, actually wants to remind us that what's taking place here is not just the wonderful, feel-good story of an oppressed group of people who have been set free. That this group of people who have been set free are children of promise, and that they are children of purpose. So there's a handful of things that the narrator draws our attention to remind us that this is more than just a feel-good moment. So for instance, there's a whole bunch of allusions to and kind of examples of things that happened to Abraham, the patriarch, the first kind of member of what would become the Israelite nation. His son Isaac had two sons, one of whom was Jacob, who was renamed by God Israel, from whom the nation comes. And in the first little section here, there's a handful of little allusions to it. In Genesis chapter 15, for example, God actually tells Abraham that his descendants, once they become a mighty nation, will be oppressed in a foreign country for 400 years. And if you have a look in chapter 12, verse 40, we're told, "Now the length of time the Israelite people lived in Egypt was 430 years. At the end of the 430 years, to the very day, all the Lord's divisions left Egypt." Abraham in chapter 12 of the book of Genesis had been told and promised that his descendants would become a mighty nation. And again, here we have another reference to that. In verse 37, we're told there were about 600,000 men on foot besides women and children. And this reminds us just how significant this one man and his wife, who had no children, had become given the promise of God. That's followed immediately afterwards by reference to the fact that many other people went up with the Israelites. So there's a whole bunch of Egyptians, we assume, who, after having seen what the Lord could do, decided to throw out their Egyptian gods and throw their lot in with the God of Israel. And this is part of the blessing that God had promised to Abraham would spill over to the entire world. There's also this kind of curious little parallel with what the Israelites do as they leave and something that happened to Abraham. In verse 35 and 36 of chapter 12 in Exodus, the Israelites were told by Moses to ask their neighbors for any nice things that they had, and were told that they plundered Egypt. So as they were leaving in the middle of the night, it was the whole kind of, hey, I really like that necklace. I've always really liked that necklace. Oh, well, here it is. Please just leave. You know what? That's a really nice jacket. Is it? Here, have it. You can just go. Just please leave as quickly as you can. And in chapter 12 of Genesis, Abraham had his own little mini plunder session. He had not yet trusted in the promises of God. And had gone down to Egypt, where he was afraid that his wife would be taken into Pharaoh's palace and that they would kill him as her husband. And so he said to his wife, Sarah, just tell everyone that you're my sister, I'm your brother, and maybe that way I'll survive. So that's exactly what happens. She ends up being taken into Pharaoh's court. And unbeknownst to Pharaoh, he didn't know that they were married, but nonetheless, God unleashes plagues and diseases on Pharaoh's household until Pharaoh realizes what's happened, brings Abraham in, gives him back his wife, and says, take all the gifts that we gave you for her and just go away. And so Abraham, after lying and not trusting God, leaves with more stuff than he had at the beginning. That's how the promise of God works in Genesis. I'm not sure what the moral of that story is for us, to tell you the truth. But nonetheless, he has his own little moment where he walks away, walks out of Egypt with more than he had at the beginning, which is exactly what happens here. And so the narrator, I think, wants to remind us that what's happening here, this exodus of the people of Israel, is not just the exodus of a group of people. These are the people to whom God has promised some amazing things. But the narrator also wants to draw our attention to the fact that while there is a promise, there's also a purpose. And this really stood out to me in a couple of the details that we find in this section. And I found them really remarkably curious. So you have in verse 31, Pharaoh summoning Moses and Aaron, saying, up, leave my people, you and the Israelites, go worship the Lord as you've requested. Take your flocks and herds as you said, and go and bless me. The Egyptians urged the people to hurry and leave the country, for otherwise we will all die, they say. The Israelites ask them for all the good stuff, and they give them all the good stuff. And then tucked away in the middle of that, in verse 35, we have this utterly bizarre detail. So there's a massive exodus. The people are leaving the country in the middle of the night, and the narrator tells us this. So the people took their dough before the yeast was added and carried it on their shoulders in kneading troughs wrapped in clothing. As if that's the most important detail that he could have drawn our attention to. And in case you think, oh, well, maybe it's just kind of a one-off. He got distracted momentarily and wanted to tell us about the unleavened dough. Have a look then in verse 39. With the dough that the Israelites had brought from Egypt, they baked loaves of unleavened bread. The dough was without yeast because they had been driven out of Egypt and did not have time to prepare food for themselves. This would be like me telling you I had the most amazing day this week. So I got up and left the house. I grabbed my keys and my wallet. And of course, in my wallet is my gym membership card. And then I went on to tell you about my amazing day. And you'd be like, when does the gym membership card come into it? Well, that sounds like an important detail. Why else would you include that detail unless it was going to play an important role in the story? So here the narrator has basically thrown this kind of random detail. Because think about it. Think what's not in this passage. The people of Israel have been in Egypt for 430 years. They have been brutally oppressed for the last several generations, and we're not told a single thing about how they left. We're not told whether they were happy or sad. We're not told whether they left with jubilation and worship and with great thankfulness to God. We're not told any of that stuff apart from the fact that they took their dough with them and then made unleavened bread with the unleavened dough that they... What's that all about? particularly when you got the Red Sea thing coming, right? There's the Red Sea. Like, that's good storytelling. Shouldn't you just kind of fast forward to the good bit? And in case you kind of think, oh, maybe it's just those references, the narrator then feels in verse 43 of chapter 12 that this is the best place to just give you a few more restrictions around the celebration of the Passover. I didn't include it when they first talked about the Passover a couple of chapters ago, and they haven't included it in the law where it would have fit quite comfortably. No, they interrupt the story to tell us a whole bunch of stuff about who can and who cannot eat the Passover. And essentially, if I can boil it all down, it comes down to whether or not the men in the house have been circumcised. That's the big deal. There's like 3 or 4 references to circumcision and eating the Passover meal. You think, okay, well, fine, you've included that. And then chapter 13 starts with a whole bunch of information about the festival of unleavened bread that's supposed to last for 7 days. And when your son asks you why you're doing it, you're supposed to give him this answer, which is followed by some information on the consecration of the firstborn. Anyone else a little confused by this? Like, couldn't you have just waited 2 chapters? Because then you're into the law. Just put it in the law. Just stick with the story because you've got a cracking story here. The people are leaving, it's all exciting, and then Pharaoh changes his mind and chases them to the water. Just focus on the action. Most of us stream movies these days, but do you remember watching movies on television? Right? With ads in them? This is like the last set of ads, the really long set of ads just before the end of the movie. It's 11:30, you've been watching since 6, it's only an hour and a half movie, and there's this final set of advertisements. And here are the advertisements. Hey, everybody, we've got this fantastic kneading trough, and it has adjustable straps to carry with you. The cloth comes off. You can wash it, which is really extra hygienic. Men, make sure you check into the clinic before next year's Passover so you can participate in that festival. And for any of you who are still wondering about what the official stance is on the consecration of firstborn or unleavened bread, please make sure you download your free copy at www.exodus.god.ot, right? Wow, there you go. So there's this bizarre little interruption. You got this fantastic story, and the narrator's just kind of gone, whoa, let's look at all these things. And I was trying to figure out what was it about these details, unleavened bread and circumcision and the festivals and consecration, what was it about these things that the narrator felt was so important? And I think it falls into that category of he wanted to remind us that they're the people of the promise, and he wanted to remind us that they are also people of purpose. Because all of these things, the unleavened bread that they carried with them as they rushed out of Egypt, the consecration of the firstborn of both children and animals, the circumcision of any males within the family, the rhythm of the celebration of Passover and of the festival of unleavened bread were the signs that set Israel apart from the surrounding nations. They were the sorts of things that the people of Israel did that set them apart. These were the things that if you spent time in Israel, if you spent time in that nation, that would be just a little bit unique. The reasoning behind them would have been a little bit different than any other reason that you would have heard. If you stayed around for a whole year, you would have been part of their religious festivals, and you would have come across the festival of unleavened bread. You would have come across the Passover. You would have heard the stories. If you knew some friends and they had children and the children were boys, you would have been invited to and participated in and seen the act of circumcision. You would have understood the consecration. You would have asked the same sorts of questions that the son asks, why do you do this? These were the signs that set Israel apart and reminds us that they are not being set free for nothing. Or they're not being set free to just do whatever they want. They're being set free to be a living, breathing example of what it looks like to live in relationship with the God of Israel. They are to be, as I've described before, a bit of a demo home, a show home, right? So that anyone who engaged with them, anyone who kind of spent any time with them, would begin to understand what it looked like in terms of worship of the one true God and in terms of interactions with other people, what it looked like to be in that relationship. This is what set them apart and what we're moving to once the people are actually out of Egypt. After they get past the Red Sea, they come to Mount Sinai, and the law is given to them, and they are set apart to be, as we talked about before, a kingdom of priests, mediating the blessing of God to the nations. These are a people of promise and a people of purpose. And when we then think about our own interaction with this story, and remember, the Exodus account is one of the most significant stories in the entirety of the Bible because it is told and retold and reflected on and reinterpreted again and again and again and again. Jesus uses this story to describe and explain part of what he was on about. The Apostle Paul uses imagery from this time in Israel's history to help us understand what's happened for us in Jesus. And you and I, just like the people of Israel, are people of promise. God has promised that he will restore and renew all things through Christ Jesus, and we are also people of purpose. Which begs the question then, what are the signs and symbols that we carry with us that set us apart? Because it's not what's here. Right? Christians aren't set apart by necessarily what they eat or what they don't eat. Christians aren't set aside anymore by the rite of circumcision. We're not set apart even so much anymore by the festivals that we may or may not pay any attention to. We're Baptists here. We don't do any kind of uniform really, but you can see the appeal of a uniform, can't you? Some indicator, some sort of sign that says you're in. You're part of what we're on about. A sign and a symbol to our wider world, right? Be kind of nice. You placed your faith in Jesus, you're part of GBC, here's your uniform. I think it'd be blue with a maple leaf on the front. I think that'd be a really nice uniform, right? I think it'd be a beautiful one, maybe not. But we don't do those sorts of things anymore, right? There's no physical outward sign that necessarily marks us as believers, that necessarily marks us as those who are following Jesus. But what are the signs that set us apart? Because we have been set apart. We have been set apart for a purpose. So what are those signs? Well, they're the inward signs of character, aren't they? Of humility, of compassion, of love, of a willingness to forgive. They are the characteristics and virtues of Jesus. Having an attitude that is based in gratefulness, having a posture of service to those around us, not being anxious about what we will eat or what we will drink or what we will wear. About being people who in our character and our virtue trust God with all that we are. And those virtues and those characteristics are signs that set us apart. But they don't set us apart so that we can be separate. Right? Some things, of course, separate people, right? That's the problem with the uniform, right? Yes, it identifies me as part of that group, but it also means that if you don't have the same uniform, you are not part of my group. The character and virtues that we are given to set us apart are actually meant to be more inclusive. The people of Israel took the symbols and signs that they had been given, and eventually those signs of circumcision and what they did and didn't eat and how they did and didn't worship divided them from everyone else in the world. And Jesus came to destroy all that. And he has given us a different set of symbols, a different set of signs that not set us apart, but actually mark us as his. We don't do this so much anymore because we have smartphones, and our smartphones tell us what to do and where to go, right? They direct our lives. If you're in Miranda now these days, and you go to the shopping malls and whatnot, you need to find where you're going, you go to one of those self-serve kiosks, and you type in what you want, and it directs you someplace. But do you remember, have you ever asked a person for directions? Right? It still happens occasionally, right? I remember going to the soccer field, and you bring the kids, and there's a field you hadn't played at before, and you're looking for field number 4. I don't know, it beats me where field number 4 is. And so you'd go up to someone in an orange vest, someone who looked like a local, and you'd say, hey, do you know where field 4 is? And they'd say, yeah, it's just, third one over, or whatever it might be. You ask locals because they have local knowledge, right? And I actually reckon that this is a fairly helpful image for us about what the characteristics and virtues of Jesus do for us. Because those characteristics and those virtues ultimately mean that we become citizens of the kingdom of heaven, right? The kingdom of heaven, which has a yet future component, but also has a here and now component. That Jesus has come to restore and renew the entire world, beginning in the here and now and ultimately being consummated in the end. That's the plan. That's what we're being invited into. And so you and I, as we allow the Holy Spirit to conform our character and conform our virtue to the likeness of Jesus, become more and more comfortable in the neighborhood. We become locals in the kingdom of heaven. We become used to where things are and how things work and who knows what and who needs to go where and all of those sorts of things, which means that when someone, metaphorically speaking, shows up and they are lost, they can ask us, hey, do you know where Field 4 is? They can ask us, hey, do you know where life is? Hey, do you know where true generosity lives? Hey, do you know where stress-free living exists? Do you know where I can find freedom from regret and shame and sin and the things that are dying in my life? Do you know how to get there? And we can say, yes, we do. Yes, we do. But beyond that, if you've ever worn the orange vest in ground control, if you've ever worked in the lobby of some building and you see someone coming onto the grounds or someone entering the lobby and they look lost, your task is not just to stand there and wait to see if they get more lost. Isn't your task ultimately to step forward and say, hey, you look lost. Can I help you? Are you looking for someone? Are you looking for something? And the characteristics and virtues that we have been given invite us as locals in the kingdom of heaven to look out for people who are lost and say, can I help you? What are you looking for? Can I direct you to Jesus? Can I direct you to the source of life? Can I direct you to the source of freedom? Because we have been, just as the people of Israel were, called out by promise and called out to purpose. Israel was set free to follow God. We have been set free to be residents of the kingdom of heaven, and not only to help those who need it, but to actively be looking for them. Set free to follow God.
We hope you've enjoyed today's New Horizons program. You can download the companion study guides for each program from the Guymer Baptist Church website. Go to guymerbaptist.org.au/New Horizons. These are available for each episode, or you can download the whole series. Guymer Baptist Church in Sydney's southern suburbs is a contemporary evangelical church seeking to serve our local community and help them to know Jesus. At the heart of all we do is the desire to help people love God in all aspects of their lives. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can do so via the contact page on our website or visit our Facebook page.
Just like the people of Israel, you and I, who have placed our faith in Jesus, have been called and saved by a promise and sent with a purpose. And I trust that you've been reminded again, not only of the great promises of God that saved us, but also the purpose to which He sends us. And I trust that this week, your eyes will be a little bit more open, your ears a bit more open, and your heart a little bit softer to see and hear and discern the invitation of God to participate with Him in His plans to restore all things in Christ Jesus. Hope to see you again real soon. God bless.